Welcome, everyone, to the very first release event for COSN's new Driving K-12 Innovation Series. Really thrilled. If you have been on Twitter, on COSN's website, on LinkedIn, and really anywhere where you get your education news, hopefully you've seen now that the first report in this new series is out, the 2019 hurdles. And if you haven't yet, we invite everyone to access a free copy of this publication at the link listed on the slide. That's cosin.org/K12 Innovation. We're really excited to be joined by a panel of experts, a handful of members of the Driving K12 Innovation Advisory Board, who will be sharing their thoughts on the report that just came out, as well as a slew of related topics. And so they're going to be introducing themselves in just a moment. But before we get into our panel discussion today around the contents of the report, we thought it'd be helpful to provide some context for you, especially since this is a brand new COSN initiative. So Driving K-12 Innovation is COSN's new series to inform smarter technology strategies for schools. So if you're a school leader, this one's for you. For those of you who are on Twitter or have a Twitter account and it's about time to dust it off, know that there is a hashtag for this initiative, and it's hashtag Driving K-12 Innovation. So in addition to leveraging the chat functionality in this webinar room, we encourage you to engage in a back-channel conversation on Twitter using this hashtag, which we can continue long after the webinar ends. So we talked about the very first report released in the Driving K-12 Innovation Series. That's about the hurdles. What are hurdles exactly, aside from things that we watch runners try and jump over during Olympic and other sporting events? Well, in the context of Driving K-12 Innovation, hurdles are roadblocks that force schools to slow down, prepare themselves, and make the leap. And so when we talk about some of the hurdles on the onset, they may not seem like lofty challenges. They may just seem like things that we're thinking about that actually do present a number of challenges that invite schools to be more innovative in their thinking and how they could surmount those challenges or those hurdles. Just to provide some more context, this report is the first in a series of reports coming out for 2019. So first, we're focusing on the greatest challenges posing a barrier to innovation in K-12. But next, we're going to be talking about the real-world megatrends that are driving the needs and skills expected of learners, of school leaders, of practitioners. So we're really excited to be releasing the next report in April in conjunction with COSN's annual conference in Portland. More on that later. And the final publication in this series is Tech Enablers. So we only kind of get into the real nitty-gritty conversations about technology in the context of how they are helping us overcome the hurdles and take advantage of the accelerators. So we're really looking forward to releasing the Tech Enablers report from this series in June in conjunction with Iste's annual conference. And in addition to the Tech Enablers report, we'll also be releasing a toolkit to help people take the ideas from the series and put them into practical action. Again, just a synopsis of the series release dates. And yes, this slide deck will be circulated in case you miss anything or I go too fast. And I want to just take a moment and say a deep thank you, a heartfelt thank you to COSN's Driving K-12 Innovation sponsors for making this work possible. Thank you so much to our amazing sponsors. And again, thank you to our Global Advisory Board for making this work possible. If you've just gotten a copy of the report, if you're looking at it now, know that so much work went into it from the advisory board. They engaged in a several-month asynchronous discourse around the topics that you see here and many others, and they actually selected the top topics featured in each of these reports. And so again, here's a link to download the first report, the hurdles. And this was put together based on lots of feedback and surveys from over 100 renowned ed tech experts in various roles and facets in the field. One thing I also want to point out is even though the hurdle report features 5 hurdles impeding innovation in K-12 globally, know that there is a whole host of hurdles considered. So we have our 5 that are featured in the report highlighted here. But as you can see, there are a number of other listed in black hurdles that the advisory board considered and discussed. In fact, some of these hurdles were newly proposed by advisory board members. The COSIN team seeded an online workspace with a predetermined kind of set of hurdles, but we invited the advisory board to expand our own initial thinking and provide new ideas for new hurdles. And so some of the ones carried forward in the report actually came from the advisory board. What we next asked the advisory board to do for each hurdle was to better define it, scope how thorny the hurdle was, how surmountable it is, imagine the implications if the hurdle is not addressed, reflect on how the hurdle is materializing at their schools, districts, municipalities, their school systems, and then discuss ideas for how the challenge could be solved, and of course, what's missing from our list. And so the goal would be to refresh our list year after year moving forward. And so we have our hurdles results. We asked the advisory board to first kind of give us a sense of what hurdles they were experiencing in their own environments. So you could see a set of 5 hurdles here that represents the 5 most commonly faced hurdles by our advisory board. But then what you see what's featured in the report are the top 5 hurdles that the advisory board believes are the most important for schools to address in 2019. So there's already a little bit of a disparity between the most common challenges faced by the advisory board and what they decided to vote through to be featured in the report. Of course, there's some commonalities. We see digital equity was a commonly faced, scaling and sustaining innovation was a commonly faced hurdle, and one that the advisory board thought worthy to feature in the report. And then I mentioned that the advisory board then ranked the hurdles in order of difficulty to surmount, 1 being the easiest to surmount and 5 being the most difficult. As you could see, the scoring from the top 5 hurdles, the differences is pretty nominal, from the easiest hurdle being ongoing professional development all the way to the toughest hurdle, the tallest hurdle, which is scaling and sustaining innovation. Not a huge difference. All this is to say is these are all very thorny challenges that require attention in 2019 and beyond. And again, this deck will be circulated, but there's quick definitions both in the report infographic and here about what each hurdle is. And then the same process occurred for the accelerators. I'm just, again, going through it pretty quickly for the sake of time, knowing that you will be able to access the slide deck. And now we're ready to move on to questions to our panel. And again, if you have questions as you're listening to this in the audience, I invite you to please type them in the chat. And there will also be a Q&A period towards the end of this conversation where you can enable your microphones and ask questions that you have for the panelists. All right, I think we are ready to dive in and get started with our panel. And because you all could introduce yourselves way better than I could reading from a bio sheet, I'd love to ask each of you to introduce themselves, starting with you, Heather.
Hi, my name is Heather Gauk, and I have been teaching special education in Michigan for the past 24 years. And I am also the founder of innovationclassroom.com.
Thank you, Heather. Over to you, Daniela.
Hi, everyone. This is Daniela Silva. I'm a global citizen. I have worked in Qatar and China with the educational technology field. I'm currently working at Lima, Peru, and I'm the Director of Technology and Innovation at the American School of Lima.
So happy to have you joining us here today. Thank you. Over to you, Gavin.
Hi, I'm Gavin Dykes, and my major role is in the Education World Forum, where I'm director. That's a meeting which happens each year. It's a meeting of ministers of education. This year we have, at the moment, 95 ministers who are coming to London for that event. So it's policy related, and I'm based in London, England.
Awesome. Thank you for joining us, Gavin. And coming to us all the way from Australia, Cam, introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi, it's Kim Flintoff here from Curtin University. I'm a Learning Futures Advisor. I've spent a lot of time sort of speculating on what the future of tech and education and other societal trends might impact on university teaching and learning, but I also work a lot with the K-12 sector as well. So thanks for having me on board.
Thank you, Kim. Over to you, Sophia.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sophia Mendoza coming to you from Los Angeles Unified School District, second largest school district in our nation. And my role as the director of the Instructional Technology Initiative is to bring forth promising practices across our large district. And I'm also proud to say that I'm a 2018 Next Gen leader for COSIN and EdScoop. So thank you again for the invitation and chance to participate in this great dialogue.
Woohoo! Congratulations. That's very exciting. And there'll be more information about exciting COSIN opportunities at the end of the presentation here too. All right, over to you, Øystein.
Yeah, hi everybody. Great to be on board. My name is Øystein Johannessen. I come from Norway, and today I'm the chief executive of a small town in northern Norway. I do come from a policy background, having worked in the Ministry of Education with ICT strategy for education and research. Thanks.
Wonderful to have you joining us. Thank you. And last but certainly not least, Tony.
Hi, everybody. My name is Tony Inglesi, and I work for Batavia Schools, which is a far west suburb of Chicago. And in that district, for many years, I served as the Chief Information Officer. And for the last couple, I've served as the Chief Financial Officer, although I do still refer to myself as the recovering CIO, because I miss that work. It was much more exciting than the work that I do now.
Awesome. We're so lucky to have you and your diversity of experience joining us today. And for those of you in the audience, if you're thinking, hey, these are awesome people I'd like to be more deeply connected with, and if you're sitting here thinking, I agree with some of these ideas, I disagree with others, well, might you think about adding your voice to the initiative? We'd love to have you. There is a form on the COSIN Driving K-12 Innovation site where you can nominate yourself to serve on a future Driving K-12 Innovation Advisory Board. So we'd love to have you nominate yourself. All right, now that we're all introduced, we're ready to kick off our programming. I know this is a lofty challenge I put out to the panelists, but since this is a brand new series and innovation has taken on different meanings to different people, I'd love to ask each of the panelists in 1 second, or not 1 second, 1 sentence, 1 second would be much trickier, to briefly say, what does it mean to you to drive K-12 innovation? And Tony, since we ended with you, I'll pick on you first.
I would say succinctly, purposeful, deliberate progress.
Nice. Heather?
I would say pushing higher level thinking for all students, even those who struggle in school.
Yes, all about the students. Daniela?
I would say it means that I need to be the lighthouse practitioner to transform the learning experience of our students.
Wonderful. Gavin, what does it mean to you to drive K-12 innovation?
A single sentence is a challenge. I think it is recognizing what makes the difference and supporting and developing that. Innovation is not about things, it is about people.
Yes, well said. How about you, Øystein?
Well, I also have a challenge with the one sentence thing, but to follow up on Gavin, I think this is about a collaborative, collective, and iterative effort guided by research-based and empirical knowledge. And you can't do that without people.
Amen. Sophia, what do you think?
For me, it's working collaboratively to find solutions to problems of practices impacting classroom teachers.
Well said. And Kim, what about you?
I think for me, it's about creating the conditions that enable the changes that are going to make education relevant and connected to the major global challenges that we're facing in the near future.
I love that. And I was reading I don't know if I saw an article or if I was looking at a graphic, but there's a really nice summary produced, and I'll have to find the source, noting the difference between innovation and change, I believe it was. And it was, are you wanting to make incremental improvements, or are you looking for a radically different outcome, which means you need to change your approach altogether? So just something that just something to be thinking about as we're talking about driving K-12 innovation. In the absence of empirical evidence, when we're trying to create new best practices, how do we create new best practices and then develop processes to get the empirical evidence? So just some food for thought as we dive into our first or our second panel question here. And so I would like to ask you, starting with you first, Kim, what are your general reactions to the hurdles voted into the report versus those that were left on the cutting room floor?
Just because we haven't ranked the hurdles doesn't negate the fact that they're all implicated in a broader ecosystem of education, culture, and society. I mean, most of the top 5 are going to be difficult, if not impossible, to overcome without addressing many others that were further down the rankings. So I think we have to engage in more systems thinking and factor in all of these hurdles in a real sort of interdisciplinary mindset. And we have to be mindful that we've got to consider all of these hurdles in any solutions that we design. So I suppose to sum it up, they're codependencies. The system won't be completely healthy until all of these have been addressed, and trying to address any of the hurdles in isolation will probably generate new hurdles and amplify others on the list.
Really well said. And innovation doesn't exist in a vacuum.
Absolutely.
Sophia, what's your line of thinking on this?
I feel that they were very spot on, especially on the work that I'm living in from day to day. Every one of them really touches a component of the work that we're involved in, whether it be looking at promising practices to support teachers when they're asking, well, what does something look like? Really honed in on the scaling and sustaining the innovation piece, as well as technology and the future of work, really touched heavily upon the work that we're doing in our expansion for computer science from pre-K to 12. So, and everything in between, especially the ongoing professional development, and how do we continuously provide that equity piece and really defining what equity means to us. Seeing that everyone has various definitions of what that means, really coming together and defining it for ourselves. And always that gap that we're seeing between the technology and the pedagogy going hand in hand together. So I felt that they were very spot on for such a very diverse group coming together. But I feel the same way as the panelists spoke about earlier. Several that were left on the cutting room floor, we need to still address them. So how can we continue to cross-stitch these efforts together to get to where we can be able to support our students' needs most effectively? So I completely agree, and I feel, again, they're very spot on with the current challenges we're facing here in Los Angeles.
Nice. Well, I appreciate you sharing that. And just to put you on the spot a little too, especially because you mentioned professional development, and Sophia, you and I had a nice conversation a week ago. Professional development comes in many forms, and sometimes it comes, informally through volunteer efforts. And so I'd love for you to speak to your experience as an advisory board member of K-12 Innovation and kind of share with me what you did last week and how it kind of impacted your thinking as an education professional.
As I know we talked a lot, are you referring to my experience as a member of the advisory board, that piece?
Yeah. So when talking about professional development and recognizing these hurdles and equity, how does experiences like the one you just had with driving K-12 innovation come into?
Yes, so I'm glad you brought that up. For myself, in the position that I hold here with in the district office, it can be very isolating. I am the only person that does have this position. So to be able to come together with others who actually are in the same type of role that I am. It was very, gosh, I know the word earlier that I used was, it was very reassuring, and it's like, great, I feel I'm on the right pathway. I'm with my tribe of people. I've made some great contacts, and be able to have this as a professional learning for myself, this networking opportunity. So I'm just so grateful that COSIN was able to bring us all together, because now I have an additional network of individuals that I can now reach out to. So it's been a great experience, for me, because again, this can be an isolating field when you're, the only one charged with these efforts, and to bring everyone along. And again, it was just very reassuring to know that there's others out there supporting the work, and they're just a click away. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for speaking to that experience, and, remembering that, there's a ton of professional development opportunities happening both formally within schools, but also outside. So this is one of the big things that we're going to come back to later. So I appreciate you addressing that. Oysten, I'd love for you to weigh in on the hurdles and what was left on the cutting room floor, or any additional comments you might have. I think you're on mute still.
Yeah, just a couple of reflections on looking at the slide and the five, especially the five hurdles. And I think one thing about them is that they are very generic, and they are easily recognized from professional practice. So and they also have a very nice distribution. They touch on different issues that I think we all know from educational. The second observation is that I also recognize many of these hurdles from various initiatives and projects and studies. And I mean, the thing is, though, that some of these observations are maybe 10 or 15 years old. So, so the world hasn't changed that much over the last decade. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but there is a high degree of recognition, but again, some of these observations date back to early days of the century. Thank you.
I think that's a wonderful point, actually. And, while this is a 2019 report, of course, for people planning the 2019, 2020 in the next few years, it is important to point out that these hurdles didn't just materialize out of nowhere. They're not new. Measuring the intangibles of learning, for example, tale as old as time. So how do we put new energy and new thinking and look at, emerging technologies that have come out in the last few years, and ones that are nascent, and think about creating kind of like new efforts to approach these hurdles? Again, back to this notion of incremental change versus innovation. What could we do? What could we try that's radically different? Balancing that, of course, against political pressures and, wanting to provide the best possible experiences for teachers and students. Okay, moving on, I want to talk a little bit about one of the big kind of issues was that there is a disparity, again, between the hurdles that the advisory board are most commonly facing in their own school systems and environments versus what they voted into the report. So digital equity is, voted into the report, but it's not a common challenge faced by the advisory board. It is an interesting one. So I'd love to ask you first, Heather, since digital equity was not among the top 5 most common hurdles faced by the advisory board member, how would you characterize this challenge, particularly as it relates to your school?
Well, I teach in an urban setting, and but in and around the city, that I teach in, there definitely are some districts that are more affluent, and so it has been very interesting to see how you see some districts who, when we talk even about the hardware, the devices, that there's some districts who have been one-to-one for it seems like forever. And then in the district that in, uh, we had to take quite a bit of time to finally pass a bond where the kindergarten, first grade classes have 5 iPads in their classroom. Then the second, third graders, they have 2 Chromebooks, or a Chromebook for each 2 students. And then, on up until in the higher grades, then they are one-to-one. So I guess just looking at that equity of even digital devices, how can we have education be equitable when some districts have one-to-one devices and have been working in that, really being able to show what they know in a different way than districts who haven't had access. The other thing that you look at is even at some districts who have technology coaches, and then there's other districts who have nobody to help. So we're sort of, as teachers, we're floundering with how do you figure out how to integrate technology to really push these higher level thinking skills when we don't have specific support. And so that really has been something that I have been trying to figure out. And I've been asking questions for quite a while on how do we make this equitable.
Thanks so much for sharing your perspective, Heather. I'd be really interested to hear from you, Øystein, how this challenge is materializing in Norway and how you'd characterize it there.
Well, I think that when I look at the issue of digital equity, which has been called or labeled in different ways with different terms over the years, there's a certain degree of nostalgia related to digital equity, because I think since I started working in this field around late 90s, it has always been there. It's a topic that never goes away, but it may include new facets and new dimensions, but this is one example of what I talked about a few minutes ago, about how some of these hurdles we're talking about, they have been there for a very long time. Digital equity has traditionally been a lot about infrastructure, about gadgets, but it takes on new forms. You have to look at teacher training, how you in a national system, or when you, as I do today, when I hire teachers, you have to make sure that you employ teachers who are sort of digitally savvy. Another example of how you can have to address digital equity is if you make curriculum changes. Norway is one of the countries with a national curriculum, and these changes requires the use of ICT. You also have to ask a number of questions about what are the consequences of the changes you make. A last point I would like to make is that today in the community I work, we see in almost every aspect of education that there are a number of families. This is a social issue. There are a number of families that are very hard to reach. It's like a 5% community. And if you talk about bullying in schools, if you talk about literacy, or if you talk about digital literacy, it's always a group of families, a group of parents, group of students that you don't hear their voices. And I think that's in a time where we try to get everybody on board. I think that's one of the issues that may make digital equity what you call a wicked challenge. And maybe that's one of the reasons why it never goes away, because there are always issues coming on board. Some of the old ones may fade away. I mean, infrastructure, of course, or access in the mobile setting. access is maybe not as important as before, but still, every time you make a change, you may face new dimensions of digital equity or inequity. Thank you.
No, thank you. It's making me think of a popular carnival game here in the U.S. called Whack-A-Mole, where you solve one dimension of a challenge and a new one pops up. And so I think that very much speaks to all these hurdles, and that and this is not a pessimistic statement, in that, you know, not that they'll never quite go away. It's not that. It's just new dimensions are going to rise, and the better that we get at solving other dimensions, the better we'll get at solving the new ones that pop up too. So we're gaining fluency. Gavin, I'd love your take on the digital equity hurdle.
Thank you so much. All kinds of things are important. Equity is kind of the most important in so many ways, and all kinds of things came to mind as people were speaking. So, for example, if you're wanting a successful education, the saying that what you should do is choose your family, not your school, because equity comes from, and understanding and the ability to learn is so important beyond what happens in school. So that engagement of parents that Iste talked about is absolutely critical. Another thing that just came to mind as people were speaking was a teacher that can be replaced by a computer should be. Now, that was not a criticism of teachers. That was actually celebrating that teaching is much more than simply doing what a computer typically does. Now, computing is improving with artificial intelligence, of course, but still the human conditions and the humanity of a teacher working with a student, building a relationship, building trust, and supporting that student in seeking to reach that student's definitions of success. That's what I think teaching should be about in a lot of ways. I think there's something also, another saying which came to mind is the amplifying of quiet voices. Too often in education, there are loud things and powerful things that are happening, education and life, but actually the amplification of quiet voices, listening to people, using technology to listen to people and to hear what is being said, so that we can understand better how to support the learners in front of us and learners more widely. And it reminded me of one piece of work I did in India, where one of the things, we don't realize our own prejudices in all of this. As we're trying to deal with equity. Some of our own prejudices come from things like this work in India, where I had teachers working, this was with the Agastya Foundation, teachers working with international teachers, teachers from India and international. Teachers from India were concerned about using a Western language like English as the medium of our discussion. The reason for the concern was that in the use of English, because of the construction of the grammar, we tend to give too much credit to the subjects of sentences and not enough to broader communities. So the view of the the Western languages was this credit to I did this or I did that to some person like that. Whereas actually the Eastern languages give much greater credit to the community as a whole. So I think all these things play in. We don't always realize our prejudices in what we're dealing with. And part of the solution of this is working collaboratively, and collaboration means listening.
Well said, Gavin. There is such thing as unconscious bias. And so it's really important to, to question ourselves, no matter how far along we get, in our careers and our own views, to constantly questioning, why is this happening? How did these thoughts, get in the first place? So good opportunity to segue over to our next question, which deals with our thorniest hurdle, or the one with the highest ranking in terms of the most difficult hurdle to surmount. This one is all about schools and school systems not having the agility, strategies, mindsets, etc., to move innovative technology practices from just a handful of exemplars to really scale them across an entire school system, state, country, whatever it is. So I'd love to ask you, Tony, why do you think that this hurdle was voted as the thorniest, the toughest hurdle?
I think it's exceptionally complex, and I think we're still trying to determine what it is that we're doing with these institutions. And I think Gavin was the first to hit on it, saying that innovation is really about making schools more human, more responsive to humanity. And I think what's tricky is these institutions existed at a time previous where the goal was different. The goal was to be efficient in delivering education and not necessarily effective to the masses. Those that were going to succeed in school would, and many would fall by the wayside. And then now the expectation is that everybody succeeds, and that's difficult. I would say too, maybe perhaps that before it wasn't possible because the technology wasn't there as it is now, where we could actually be responsive to everybody, and the challenge is to do so. And yet we're still living in the same paradigms. We're still working under the same systems and trying to innovate and seeking to do so on an individual basis. Whereas in the past, we would teach to the center of the classroom, and those that were in the corners were left in the dark. Now to innovate, we're seeking illumination in the corners. We're innovating in the corners, but it works in one particular corner, but not in the next. And it works in this particular classroom at this particular school, but not on the other side of the country or the world. And to innovate, we have to be more systematic in our approach, more systemic in our approach. And we need to make sure that all corners of the classroom are integrated in their innovations. And we need to make sure that those innovations are integrated across the grade levels, horizontally, vertically between ages as kids age through the system. And that is exceptionally complex. There's no single answer to anything. And teaching is more complex as a result of it. The benefit is that we have technology to help us, but we have to figure out the way to do so.
Yes, and speaking of figuring out the way to do so, and especially since Tony has just shared his perspective, Tony has served on COSIN's Emerging Technologies Committee, which produces the EdTech Next report series that the Driving K-12 Innovation is a part of. And so scaling and sustaining innovation, got a nice shout out, of course, in the Driving K-12 Innovation report. But I know that it's going to be a subject matter that the Emerging Technologies Committee is tackling to provide more resources and information to the COSIN community as well. So I'm really looking forward to more on work in this area from COSIN. Øystein, I know you had some thoughts to share on scaling and sustaining innovation. Would love to hear from you.
Yes, thank you, Samantha. I think that what makes this a very tricky issue is partly about complexity, as Tony said. And Kim also made the point earlier in the discussion about the need to work in a very systematic way. So working with innovation is really challenging in the sense that you really need to know, you have to dive into the knowledge base about how you can work in a sustainable way with innovation through technology. And it requires sort of access and knowledge about what methods and tools you can use. There's a lot of work on this from various organizations like the OECD and also in many countries like the UK, Norway, Denmark, Singapore, you name it. Secondly, I think working on sustaining innovation is really a team effort. And you need to have certain capacities in your organization in order to succeed. And I think the third issue I'd like to point to is that you're really in it for the long run. You have to take a long-term view. But I think if you work in a school where you have succeeded on working on quality, on school development or organizational cultures, which are other sort of wicked issues, I think you have a very good starting point, because you will then have some experiences in addressing complex issues that you can sort of rely on when you try to work on sustaining K-12 innovation. Thank you. Thank
you so much, Øystein. And before moving to the next question, and this is all so well said. And, when I think about scaling, sustaining innovation, January is the new year. I would like to think of 2019 as the year for radical transparency, because I do think that is an important facet of scaling and sustaining innovation. For innovation to be effective, the cultural conditions must be conducive to this. I think one of my fellow panelists here today may have said that in different words too. So what can we do in terms of laying the groundwork in our school cultures and our openness with each other and open lines of communication to all stakeholders? So just some food for thought as we move along to our next question. So another of the hurdles in the report is technology in the future of work. It also happens to be a major theme for COSIN's annual conference in April. To understand the role schools play in preparing both teachers and learners, we really need to have a solid grip on the future state of work. So first, I'll float this over to our futurist, Kim. What do you envision for the workforce, and what role does technology play?
Look, technology's always been there. I mean, we've moved through many ages as human beings. We began as hunter-gatherers, and we did that for tens of thousands of years. Then we became agrarians, we became farmers, and we did that for thousands of years. And then we shifted into the industrial age about 300 or 400 years ago. And then about 50 years ago, we entered the information age. And we're already coming to the end of the age of algorithms and preparing for the age of augmentation, where we start plugging ourselves in to our technology. We're already post-human, and this is being reflected in the changing context of work. And I think the demands of the future workforce are going to require much greater flexibility and adaptability across a whole range of contexts. Several years ago, at another stage of my life, I was a stage manager for Alvin Toffler, and he talked about the idea that technology feeds on itself, and given that a couple of other things that he said too were that change is constant, and that knowing how to learn is one of the greatest, is probably the greatest future literacy. And I think all of that stuff is going to become more and more relevant as we move forward in work. Workplaces are changing rapidly. And as Toffler said, change is constant. We know as we go into our workplace every year, there's new reviews, there's new ways of considering things, and they are beginning to happen faster and faster. So technology is carrying us along, sweeping us along in that whole process, because the changes that are occurring in the manufacturing field, we're going from large, huge, giant factories to on-demand manufacturing systems that are distributed. So we're starting to see new manufacturing technologies, coming out of some of the big tech companies. So new 3D printing systems that can actually print on demand, personalizing the individual items for the end user, creating a digital catalog of spare parts for the machinery that you're working with. All of these sort of things, and so that's on that grand scale. But even artisans need technology to enable the viability of their niche industries. So if you want to make and sell things on Etsy, you still need to have that fluency and the engagement with technology that allows you to probably help with the designs that you're working with, even though you may be doing, sort of cottage craft. You need the technology to enable the business side of things to occur. So there's so many different factors to this. Lifelong learning, I think, is going to become more than just a slogan that we currently bandy around. Everyone's going to need the ability to communicate with technologists and programmers. And programmers, I think, are probably going to start to become the blue collar workers of the future. We're already seeing that. We're outsourcing the technology and code, the coding and programming demands to the same countries that we and the same cultures that we've farmed out our manufacturing. We saw sweatshops producing clothing and other items, and now we're seeing similar sorts of processes around coding and programming. So in order to see how we're going to bring equity to the world, we have to be able to address a lot of these things through technology. And I suppose the biggest thing that we're starting to see now is that learning to interact on a peer basis with machines and AI, we actually need to then see the technology as a partner rather than just a tool. I mean, I think that's really starting to come to the fore. We're seeing that with a lot of the new technology. Just looking at things like Siri and the new sort of home technologies, they actually become a partner in the way that you do things, rather than simply a tool that enable things to happen. You have to be able to speak to them in a particular way. You have to be able to engage them in a certain way, and that goes for a whole range of new technologies. And I think we'll see that reflection in work, and schools need to be able to address those concerns and those issues and those challenges with the learners that they're working with. Thanks.
I love this notion of technology and tools as our partners. Thank you so much, Kim. Sophia, I'd love to get your hot take on the future workforce.
And in my role, we're doing a lot of laying that groundwork. So really reframing around what are those problem-solving skills that our students need, and also setting that mindset with our leaders, everyone from our executive leaders to our teacher leaders to our school site leadership teams, really looking at what are we asking our students to solve. So as opposed to asking students, well, what do you want to become? We start rephrasing it. What are the problems you want to solve in your communities? That way it starts to lay that foundation for the computational thinking strategies, having students become creators of their own knowledge. Because as as Kim just mentioned, there's so much that is going to be changed, that's going to be necessary for our students. So building those skills now, as opposed to waiting once they leave us, it's too late. So really a foundation that we've adopted here in Los Angeles are the Iste standards for students, the refreshed Iste standards for students, really looking at how students can become those innovative designers, how we are threading that throughout the curriculum. Again, being knowledge constructors, those computational thinkers, in a setting where it is about problem-based learning, so that this is not new to students, it's not new to teachers, it's really making those instructional shifts throughout the practice that teachers have. We've also partnered with our career technical education piece as well, to ensure that there is that continuum for our learners, so that again, once they leave us, they are prepared, that we have not done a disservice to them, that we've given them a set of tools and strategies to leap from. Again, really looking at what are those problems you want to solve in your community, and then from there, building upon their skill set, as opposed to saying this is what you will become and this is what you will do, because we don't know in fact. But what we do know is that if they have a solid foundation in skills of being an innovative designer, being able to be agents of their own learning, those are the skill sets that they're able to take with them out into the real world and to have success around this work. Another piece that sparked my interest when Kim was talking about becoming a lifelong learner, other work that we're looking very closely at is the work of Dr. Mitch Resnick at MIT around his work with the lifelong kindergarten, creating and cultivating creativity through the projects, passion, peers, and play work that he has, starting to introduce that to our teachers, executive leaders, our teacher leaders, and those who are creating the new professional development, so that we have other frameworks that we're adopting from, and again, moving away from the industrial revolution piece to more of how we are expanding and going into, we're already in the 21st century. So what do our innovations look like? How can we support what's coming down the road? So those have been some very key frameworks that we're really looking closely at, the Iste standards for students, as well as the work coming out of MIT with Dr. Mitch Resnick, to really prepare our students so once they step out into the real world, and also embedding that into our professional learning for our teachers, so that they start receiving, what's new, what's happening, so that they're not out there trying to codify and do the research, where we've done that for them, able to package that for them and be able to give them some solid examples of what that might look like and where they might be able to take it and go on to next steps. So it's just a little bit of what we're thinking here.
Thank you so much, Sophia. I really appreciate the emphasis on community, and also the concrete examples are, I think, tremendously helpful. So I appreciate that. Before we move on to one of our final questions for the panel, I just want to, let those in the audience know if you have specific questions that you would like the panel to address. We have just 10 minutes left, and so feel free to type your questions in the chat for the sake of time, and we'll absolutely get to them if we can, and if not, I know I'll be on Twitter and I'll tweet out the questions too, and see if anyone on the panel, whether now or later, can answer them as well. All right, so one of the hurdles voted into the report is the gap between technology and pedagogy. This one is another really tricky one. The advisory board really emphasized the chasm between technology adoption and pedagogical support. And so I'd love to hear from you first, Daniela. What are some potential strategies for narrowing this gap?
So from my personal experience, we were looking at ways to empower our teachers and not just give them technology for the sake of using technology in the classroom. So we started by identifying intentional risk takers that they were willing to try new teaching and learning strategies and technology. We allowed them to explore, they fail, also to assess how these new strategies or technology are actually improving their practice as teachers or the learning experience of his or her students. So we created a group called FDR, because that's the name of our school, FDR Transformers. They started playing with new toys, technology toys, also with teaching and learning strategies. And they started sharing out, because one of the things that we were looking into is, okay, we identify this group, they are risk takers, they try new things, but how do we share out their learning, their failure, and how they have overcome those challenges? So they share through our blog, through newsletter, and every time we have a faculty meeting, we're gonna start inserting some demo slams for 2 minutes for them to share out what they have learned so far.
Oh, that's a great example. Thank you so much for sharing, Daniela. I could see a number of ways it could be adopted and adapted elsewhere. I know also Heather and Gavin both have some thoughts on this. Heather, I'll go over to you first and the next Gavin.
Okay, real quickly, I know our time is limited. One of the things I have thought, over the last couple of years is usually when we are teaching our teachers are learning about curriculum and pedagogy, it is sort of separate compared to technology. So I think it would be awesome if we had, say, a technology coach or integrationist teaming up with the curriculum staff and doing professional development together as a team. And I think that might help.
Well said. And I love the emphasis on team. Over to you, Gavin.
Yeah, a number of things, and this kind of relates to a number of the different comments that have been made, much to agree with, but also other challenges in there. I think maybe we should think about anthropology a little bit more. This is thinking about the people side of it. In our relationship with technology, how well do we meet our intentions, and how well are we sucked into giving away all our attention? And I think with technology, success for technology companies has frequently been associated with the attention that they grab. It's the same with marketing. And that is one of the challenges that we face when we are seeking for people to learn and to achieve learning and to become good learners. Then it's the intention that is critical. So how can we get that technology relationship so that technology is serving our intentions rather than sucking up our attention? And I think that is a crucial part of doing that, and getting our teachers and our young people to be critical users of technology as to whether it delivers on the intention or whether it reduces our intention by moving to attention. I think that another thing is, as we're thinking about preparing people for worlds outside education and learning in different ways and jobs in different ways, is that thinking wide, not narrow. We tend to think in subjects, and actually the world does not work in subjects. If you take any of the technologies that have become, or many of the technologies that are coming new, if you're designing a self-driving car, what specific subject could you learn that helps you do that? There's an awful lot more than simply learning about programming. It's an awful lot about human behavior. It's a lot about actually the way mechanics work. It's a lot about the way our systems of driving on roads is involved. If you think about designing drones, it's about building product elements that are light enough to be able to be carried by the drone in order to be able to be used in it effectively. So it's not about narrow views of subjects, but broad views of subjects and working across subjects. So there are a number of ways in which I think as we move forward, delivering on intentions, thinking across subjects and thinking how we deliver education in a way that takes us across it and enabling our children to become critical users of technology so they know when it's an advantage and when it's not.
Oh, well said. I'd love to put that all on a t-shirt, Gavin, if I could. That is extremely important. And I know other panelists may have some ideas to share for this question too. So I invite you to share them in the chat since we are running out of time and we have one more question to get through. Our final hurdle today that we're covering is about ongoing professional development. So this is another top hurdle, and it could help us ongoing professional development could help us overcome some of the hurdles like the gap that we just talked about and like scaling and sustaining innovation. This example demonstrates how the driving K-12 innovation topics don't exist in a vacuum and how they're interrelated. So I'd love for you, for some of you to illuminate for us the importance of some of the relationships between the topics. And I'll go back to you, Tony, first on this one.
I think the key to this particular aspect is how we think of professional development. And I would make the distinction between training, professional development, and professional learning. We often use those terms interchangeably, but they, I think, have distinct meanings. But in particular, we talk about professional development as being something that, we go and do in some episodic fashion. And like Gavin just mentioned, they're usually on very narrow subjects, and yet the problems that we face are wide band. And being that they're episodic, they generally don't lead to true professional development because professional development requires a change or improvement in professional practice. And that often isn't the case. And we've known that since the 80s. There's been research since the 80s that says that the likelihood of you going to a workshop or a conference or some other narrow band subject, as we've just mentioned, the likelihood that you've actually improved your professional practice is about 15%, which isn't very good. It's pretty high risk investment for you. It's generally high in cost and yet low yield. And so we need to think about how we do things differently. And that too, and as I mentioned, we have these institutions. The institutions haven't much changed in terms of innovation because we're still paying people, in the United States at least, the very same way that we were in the 80s and even back to the 50s and earlier, with the salary schedule that incentivizes teachers to go out and get additional master's degrees and whatnot. That, well, great, that shows scholarly effort and reflection and whatnot, but isn't necessarily immediately applicable in the classroom and the challenges that we face. And so we, to make progress on the pedagogy gap, or to make progress on innovation, we really need to think about how it is that we're learning moving forward and changing those systems.
Well said, and we're just about out of time, but I know Heather has maybe some closing thoughts on this topic to share, and I'll invite Sophia to share her ideas too in the chat. And then I have just a couple announcements to make for COSIN, so stick with us. And Heather, over to you for the final word.
Okay, I just real quick, exactly what was already said. I think we need to look at doing professional development as teachers. If it is something that is interesting or that we are struggling with ourselves, that's when we should be doing the professional development. And that could be, I use, audio apps like Voxer on the phone and reaching out to teachers that way, doing book studies that way. So instead of just going and sitting, and getting what you need. I think it's real time and real problem makes the learning better.
Well said. Thank you so much, Heather, and thank you so much to all of our panelists and our audience for joining us here today. I have just a few announcements to make. The first is about the COSN Conference. Join us for COSN's biggest professional development of the year, their annual conference in Portland, Oregon. This year's theme is Envision 2030, Leadership for Learning, focusing on the role technology leaders play in envisioning, shaping, and leading the school system transformation to support student success. More information is available on the slide. In the next several days, you'll also be receiving an email in your inbox soon from CEO Keith Kruger and Board Chair Tom Ryan, inviting you to participate in the 2019 IT Leadership Survey. The results of the survey will provide critical info to you and your colleagues, as well as key policymakers on the state of K-12 leaders, their challenges, and the environments in which they work. So your input is critical to helping identify trends and experiences in the K-12 IT community. The deadline for completing the survey is January 31st, so we hope that you'll take time to complete it. And yes, participating districts will be entered into a drawing for free registration to COSN's 2019 annual conference. Another thing I want to share is with regards to the IT leadership survey. In the next several days, you'll be receiving an email again from, oh, sorry, I just got to that already, I realized as well. Sorry about that. My final announcement is actually with regards to thanking some very, very important people, and that's COSN's corporate partners. So we would like to thank all of our partners who support the webinar series and make the work possible. We appreciate your commitment to improving student learning. Again, thank you for everyone for coming here today, and we hope that you enjoy the first report in the COSN Driving K-12 Innovation series. Thank you so much. Have a great day.